Hi, everybody. We have reached the last chapter of the semester, and it's last not because it's the least important, but because it just happened to fall out that way, and that is on cross-cultural counseling or multicultural counseling. And I've seen it both ways depending on where you are and what kind of institution it is. So those of you that are thinking about going into counseling, you will take at least one, probably more courses in this area when you get to graduate school, and they will be separated out depending on where you go. You might have a class on African American or a class on sexual orientations, but essentially the idea is for different demographics you may see separate classes. And for this one, we're going to talk just about cultural, racial, ethnic differences. And this is gonna be a pretty short talk just because we're at the end of the semester and I just want to cover a few things here. Your book has good information. There are lots of textbooks about it, but rest assured you will have lots of training in this area should you decide to pursue counseling. You'll have at least one semester course, probably more. So, all right, the way to think about it is to view a person's concerns, so that would be the presenting problem here, as separate from their cultural context is surely to misunderstand them. We know that large numbers of minority clients tend to drop out of counseling, and oftentimes after the first session, because they don't feel heard, they don't feel understood, they don't feel like the counselor is going to understand them or where they're coming from. So counseling is important. Good training is important to be able to reach as many people as possible. The goal is not to become an expert. We're going to talk about this. You're not going to become a textbook expert in any particular group or any particular race or ethnicity. What we're going to talk about here in this chapter are just some overarching issues that apply to cross-cultural counseling. So let's start off with a couple definitions. By the way, attrition means dropout. So when we say high attrition rate, it means a high dropout rate. So the first thing we'll do is define the word culture. Sometimes this is mixed up with ethnicity and race. So culture involves behavior, patterns of learned behavior whose elements are shared and transmitted by members of a particular society. So these can include customs, beliefs, values, norms. So another way to think of it is that it's a way of life for a group of people. So we think about American culture, the kind of music we listen to, the traditions we have, our general American values. For example, we're a very individualistic society, that kind of thing. It is not the same as race or ethnicity, even though these terms are often used interchangeably. So let me talk about what these mean. Race has to do with skin color and physical features. Ethnicity has to do with a way to identify each other based on language or ancestral or cultural experiences. So ethnicity and culture are closer than race and culture, but they all can also be interwoven. So people of a particular race may have a particular culture and share a certain ethnicity. So it's not important to me that you get the particulars of those all straight and all the definitions, but the point I want to make is that they are separate concepts. Now, what about cross-cultural counseling? What does that mean? The way to think about it here is that when you have a counseling relationship with someone, it's always cross-cultural counseling because they are always going to be different from you in at least one way and most likely more. So cross-cultural counseling is a counseling relationship in which the participants are going to differ in terms of their culture or their values or their lifestyle or their traditions. Any of those. So every counseling interaction is going to be slightly cross-cultural is a way to think about it. And multicultural counseling historically has been seen as kind of an extra skill area. So you learn how to become a counselor, and then you learn these extra skills in order to counsel somebody who is different from you in the way of culture or race or lifestyle. We no longer think about it that way. The tradition has been for cross-cultural counseling to emphasize what we call emic approaches. This is when we focus on cultural differences between people. So if my client is Hispanic, an emic approach would be to look at how they are different from me. But the movement has been more towards what we call etic approaches. And this is when we emphasize the commonality, the universal human participants. So we emphasize what is the same about us, or what is similar, or what our communal things are. Now, also historically, cross-cultural counseling has used what we call a cookbook approach, which is where every group has a recipe. And so we have a book with instructions for counseling that particular group. So each group has a recipe with characteristics and instructions for counseling. So if my client is a Hispanic female, I can look up Hispanic women and see what are some of the characteristics that are very common to them. And if it sounds like stereotyping, it is. I mean, they try to base it on research of what they find is generally true, but of course, you're leaving out an awful lot if you use a cookbook approach. So the way to think about cross-cultural counseling is that knowing a person's race or ethnicity or culture or gender, really we could add them all in, gender or sexual orientation, gives us no information on an individual. This should be no information, not on information. Doesn't tell us anything about an individual. So if my client is African American, okay, that tells me basically what their skin color is for the most part, but it doesn't tell me anything about them. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The current view of cross-cultural counseling takes on a holistic approach, a holistic view. So we are redefining multicultural counseling in this way, and here's what's involved. So cross-cultural counseling emphasizes elements of human universality. So what do I have in common with my client? Okay, we're both grew up in America. We both identify as female. We both experience pain. All humans experience pain, experience a need for love. So what are the things that all humans have in common? And I should take out the gender part and the American part, because that's not true necessarily. So humans feel pain, they have longing, they need love, that sort of thing. Okay, and then down here, the cultural specificity elements, what we're looking for are what are some things particular to that person's culture. So maybe they have a special religious preference. Let's say they were raised in America in a strictly Jewish household. So that would be an example of cultural specificity. Or were raised in a home with 3 generations living in the same home because that's what you do in their culture. So what are some of the things that's specific to that person? And then just the uniqueness of the person. What are some of their personality characteristics? What is their background, and how does it make the person who they are today? So to really take a whole view of multicultural counseling, you have to consider all these things about the person. And when you look at it that way, it's a lot of work to get to know a person, and that's very true. But counseling is, it's about really getting to know someone at the deepest level. Okay, let's turn to some of the issues that we sometimes see in multicultural counseling in the form of what are some barriers and conflicts that we see. I remember when I was in graduate school and I was doing a practicum at Ohio State, which is a very multicultural campus. And so my cohort of counselors in training, we would have clients come in who certainly were of different races, different ethnicities, different genders, different backgrounds. And some people really struggled with some of these differences. So let's talk about what kind of can get in the way potentially. A real basic one is language. Language, if there's a language barrier, a lot is lost in translation for sure. So if a person does not have English as their first language, and that is your first language, the things that they communicate to you in English, their second language, it might not be what they're truly intending to say. There's difficulty with that. English puts emphasis on certain things. Spanish puts emphasis on certain things. So you just have to really watch for that. And if you have a translator, it can be even tougher. So I've done plenty of sessions with translators, just something to keep in mind. And then every language has an emphasis on verbal versus nonverbal. In English, at least in America, we put a lot of emphasis on nonverbals. So we always look to see if your nonverbals are matching the things that you're saying. In other countries, nonverbals are different. For example, in the United States, it's appropriate and courteous to look a person in the eye when you're talking to them. But in some cultures, that's a sign of disrespect, and people don't do that. As far as touching, facial expressions, so you could easily misinterpret a client's facial expressions or lack of eye contact as something completely different. Generally, when we come across people who don't make eye contact, we often will think, well, insecurity or shame, but that might not be the case at all, depending on where they're from. Now, another example of language I want to mention here is sign language, American Sign Language. There is a huge need for ASL interpreters in counseling. So if you are going into counseling and you learn sign language, you just could be employed anywhere. Just such a need. I don't know if I've told you this, but I've done counseling with hearing impaired individuals with an interpreter, and it's very difficult because you're supposed to, you look at the client, you speak to them, the client will then look at their interpreter to see what you said, then the client will sign what they're trying to say, and the interpreter will tell you, well, you as the counselor, you're supposed to make all your eye contact and keep looking at and communicating with the client. But there's a strong tendency to keep looking at the interpreter because they're the one speaking to you. So anyway, if you can, cut out the middle person with this, it's just such a huge advantage. Same for if you're a bilingual counselor. If you know Spanish, you'll be in demand everywhere, Spanish particularly. Okay, how about class-bound values here? Here's a really good example. My first jobs in counseling after graduate school was for a community mental health center where the client population was low socioeconomic status, almost all Medicaid patients. And I'm fresh out of counseling school with my counseling degree and my Carl Rogers philosophy of unconditional positive regard and helping people grow and all those values that we've talked about, helping remove obstacles to growth and focus on people's strengths. And I would get so frustrated with my clients because it seemed like no matter my attempts to steer them to that area, all they wanted to do was vent and just talk about all the horrible and, granted, they genuinely were horrible things happening in their life, and they couldn't pay the rent, and, their kid's father was not coming to pick the kids up. Practical problems that people have. And I was getting very frustrated and talking to my supervisor about how they wouldn't focus on what I thought they needed to focus on. And she said, you got it all wrong. Depending on your client and depending on, not everybody in the population's like this, but depending on the client, they may just need help getting through the day. So growth and self-actualization, those are concepts that are important to them, and they probably never will be. But they do need someone to talk to because they don't have a strong social person in their life to help them sort through the practical stuff. So you have to remember that depending on the population of the client, they may need survival skills from you. They may not need insight-oriented therapy. And that's true no matter, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with socioeconomic status, but oftentimes does. But that certainly could be true for their background. Some cultures, especially some Asian cultures, do not value self-disclosure. That's what we're all about for counseling, at least here. So you may have a difficult time and sort of have to realign your priorities for particular clients. Okay, a third thing to watch for or barrier would be culture-bound values. And really, I just alluded to this. Our American culture and many Western cultures value these things. We encourage our people to be independent. We encourage emotional expressiveness. We encourage direct communication. Well, again, not every society and culture values this. And this isn't a matter of, well, if you're living in America, these are the values we have. This is what you need to learn. No, you have to meet the client where they are and what they're used to. So it involves really understanding where they're coming from and what's important to them. Now, here's the thing. Nobody expects you to be an expert in every society or culture. There's no way that you can be, but it's always okay to ask. So in my mind, the best solution is don't assume anything and just always ask the question. No one is ever going to be offended by being asked questions that will help you learn how to counsel them better, but they might be offended by assumptions. So just something to keep in mind. Now, as you're going through your training to be a counselor, some of the things that you learn are basic skills, the basic counseling skills, and then you also learn how to be what's called a culturally skilled counselor. So here are some examples of characteristics that culturally skilled counselors have. First of all, they have a set of beliefs and values. Culturally skilled counselors are aware of their own heritage, of their own values, and their own culture, and they're certainly aware of their own biases. So, for example, if you assume that with respect to gender, people of particular genders should act a certain way, and people of other genders should not. People of African American heritage should behave a certain way, and people of Hispanic should not. So again, we come back to, and I've stressed this to you, be aware of your own biases. The culturally skilled counselor also has a set of knowledge, and the knowledge has to be that if you are working with someone who has minority status in the environment you're in, say the United States, you absolutely have to be aware of the possibility of discrimination, prejudice, oppression in their life, and you cannot underestimate how big of an impact that could be. So awareness of the different cultural groups and some of the things they face in our society. Again, you don't have to be an expert in every particular group, and you can't be, but it's always a good idea to ask. And then a culturally skilled counselor has a set of skills, the basic counseling skills that we've talked about. Everything we've talked about this semester is important. Okay, lastly here, I want to talk about how you become a proficient cross-cultural counselor. And we're going to turn to a theory that's been around for a few years, but it's based on the idea that as you're learning to be a counselor, you develop these skills gradually. You don't just take a class and become a culturally skilled counselor. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's a gradual process that goes in stages. So I just want to briefly give you some idea of what these stages are. So when you first enter the counseling field, many people, not all, but many people are in what's called stage 1. The treatment of your client is ethnocentric. So you don't have much knowledge of other groups, other cultural or ethnic groups, and the treatment that you apply to your client is based on your own ethnocentric view. So for example, if you're a Caucasian American, then you are basing your client on what you're basing your treatment on what your experiences have been as a Caucasian American. And we value assertiveness and independence and all that. So you're basically taking your values and applying it to your client. So that's stage 1. And we're not saying that's bad, but that's something that you have to get beyond to be in the counseling field. But it's very common for beginners, of course. For stage 2, you progress beyond the idea that you use your values to counsel other people. And we consider stage 2 is when you're first learning skills and you apply them in that textbook fashion. So think about that cookbook that I told you about. So you learn about different groups and you start applying what you learn about them just very slowly and gradually. And even though we talked about how you shouldn't do that, this is a sign that you're beginning to understand that you can't use your ethnocentricity to counsel people. So it's a step. For stage 3. Stage 3 is interesting because counselors have a tendency to have guilt over their advantage or over, and no matter what group, you could be a counselor in a minority group, but out of virtue of being a counselor, you certainly have advantage. So counselors may feel some guilt over that and then develop color blindness. So the color blindness is really, I don't see people as black or brown or white or whatever. I don't see people as poor or rich. But the problem is you have to respect that. That's a part of who they are. So you really have to respect differences between people and not deny their importance, because they are important. Stage 4 is when the counselor emerges as a cross-cultural agent for change. So you get out of the colorblindness, you're certainly out of the ethnocentricity by now, and you choose a treatment to match the worldview of the client. So you absolutely begin to understand what the client's needs and values are, and you choose a treatment that matches what they need and who they are. And then in stage 5, and then some counselors stop there. But with stage 5, the counselor begins to take social action to promote cultural pluralism and social equality. So you really just go beyond the idea of helping the individual. You try to figure out ways to promote equality for all, fairness for all, no matter what your cultural or ethnic background. So this may involve things, and you don't necessarily have to go out and protest to do it. This may involve things like becoming involved in a committee in your professional association to try and look at any racial disparities that are out there, donating to a group that aims for equality. Any way you take action beyond just the client in your outfit or in your office would count as this. So I guess the final thing I want to mention is it's always been a question as to whether people do better with a counselor who is same or similar race or ethnicity, etc. So their race match that of their clients. And the answer is no. Now, some clients may prefer that, and that's totally fine, but the studies have not found that that's an important thing for clients to change. What is more important is the client's education, similar attitudes to the client, similar personality, and sometimes a little bit older. Sometimes clients prefer counselors who are a little bit more mature. So there are other things that are important in the counseling relationship and developing a good counseling relationship besides same ethnicity. I mean, clients can certainly request that, but depending on where you are, that might not be available. So this has been just kind of a quick jaunt through some of the introductory principles to cross-cultural counseling. And as I said, those of you who continue to go onto the field, you will learn a whole lot more in graduate school.